never expected to find myself locked in a bathroom at 3 in the morning, sobbing over a dead man's blood that stained my hands in ways that no amount of scalding water and antibacterial soap could ever truly wash away, while the most dangerous crime lord in New York stood outside the door with his enforcer, demanding in that low, threatening voice that somehow managed to sound like silk wrapped around a blade that I let him in and face what I had just done. But that's exactly where my life led me the night I discovered that saving monsters doesn't make you a hero, doesn't grant you any kind of moral absolution or divine forgiveness. It makes you their property, their possession, their creature just as much as the men who willingly chose to serve them. And the worst part, the part that made my stomach twist with nausea and self-loathing, was that some dark, hidden corner of my soul had known this would happen from the moment they wheeled him through those emergency room doors with his expensive suit soaked in blood, and his eyes, those impossibly dark, fathomless eyes, locked onto mine with an intensity that felt like being marked, claimed, owned before he'd even spoken a single word. My name is Emma Castellano, and I'm a trauma nurse at St. Vincent's Hospital in Lower Manhattan, a job that requires me to have hands that stay steady when everyone else is falling apart, a mind that can calculate medication dosages and assess critical injuries while families scream and patients die, and the fluorescent lights hum their indifferent song above it all, and a heart that's learned to build walls high enough and thick enough that the constant parade of human suffering doesn't completely destroy me before I turn 30. I'm 26 years old. I've been working the night shift for 3 years because the darkness suits me and because I can't sleep anyway. Not since my younger brother Michael overdosed on fentanyl-laced heroin in a rat-infested apartment in Brooklyn 2 years ago. His body discovered by a neighbor 3 days after his heart stopped beating, and the police told me that the drugs were traced back to a distribution network run by one of New York's organized crime families, which meant that my brother's death, his beautiful, wasted, 22-year-old life, was just another casualty in the empire building of men who treated human lives like currency, like assets to be exploited and discarded when they stopped generating profit. The cruel irony, the cosmic joke that the universe seemed to be playing at my expense, was that my own father, Sal Castellano, a man I barely spoke to anymore, a man whose choices I'd spent my entire adult life running from, was a low-level associate in the Russo crime family, running numbers and doing collections in Queens, never important enough to be wealthy but always dirty enough to be ashamed of. And I'd spent years building a life completely separate from that world, changing my phone number, moving to a different borough, scrubbing any connection between his choices and my career, because I needed to believe that I was different, that I was clean, that the poison of that life hadn't infected me by virtue of shared DNA and a last name I couldn't quite bring myself to change completely. But tonight, all of those carefully constructed walls came crashing down when they brought Dante Moretti into my emergency room at 2:47 a.m., carried between 2 men in dark suits who had the kind of cold, dead eyes that told me they'd killed before and would kill again without losing a moment's sleep. And the patient, this man who looked like he'd been carved from marble by some Renaissance master and then brought to violent life, with black hair that fell across his forehead despite being soaked with sweat and blood, a jawline that could cut glass, and a body that was all lethal muscle and predatory grace even as he bled out from 2 gunshot wounds to the chest and abdomen. This man locked eyes with me the moment they crashed through the doors, and something passed between us, some dark recognition that felt like fate or damnation or both, and I knew with absolute certainty that my life was about to change in ways I couldn't begin to comprehend. Gunshot wounds, approximately 20 minutes ago. He's lost a lot of blood, but he's stable enough for transport, and you need to save his life, one of the suits said to me, not to the attending physician, not to the trauma team that was assembling around us, but to me specifically, as if he knew something I didn't, as if this had all been planned, orchestrated, arranged. My medical training kicked in automatically, my hands already reaching for his wrist to check his pulse, my eyes scanning the wounds that were still bleeding, despite the pressure bandages his men had applied, my mind calculating blood loss, and probable internal damage and the likelihood of survival. which honestly wasn't great given the location of the entry wounds and the amount of time that had elapsed since the shooting. But I'd saved patients in worse condition. I'd pulled people back from the edge of death through sheer stubbornness and skill, and refusing to let the universe claim another victim on my watch. Get him to Trauma Bay 3. I need 2 units of O-negative started immediately. Prep for emergency surgery, and someone page Dr. Richardson, because we're going to need a thoracic surgeon in here 5 minutes ago. I barked out orders, falling into the rhythm of emergency medicine. That beautiful, terrible dance where you don't have time to think about who the patient is or what they've done or whether they deserve to live. You only have time to act, to fight, to win against death itself. We cut away his suit, and even through the haze of medical crisis, I registered that it was custom-tailored, probably cost more than I made in 3 months, now ruined beyond repair, and soaked with enough blood to make it look like something from a slasher film, and his body was revealed inch by inch, and God help me, even dying he was beautiful in that terrible way that apex predators are beautiful, all power and danger and lethal perfection. His chest broad and muscled and marked with scars that told stories of previous violence survived, previous attempts on his life that had failed. But it was his eyes that held me captive even as my hands worked to save him. Those dark eyes that never left my face even as we intubated him, even as we pumped him full of blood and plasma and medications, even as I worked with Dr. Richardson to repair the damage to his lung and remove the bullet that had lodged near his spine. Those eyes that seemed to see straight through all my defenses and recognize something in me that I'd spent years trying to hide, trying to deny, trying to pretend didn't exist. He was conscious enough, despite the anesthesia, despite the blood loss, despite the fact that he should have been completely unconscious, to track my every movement, to watch my hands as they worked inside his chest cavity, to study my face with an intensity that felt invasive, possessive, claiming. And I found myself talking to him the way I sometimes talk to critical patients, keeping up a steady stream of reassurance that was as much for me as for him, telling him that he was going to make it, that we had this under control, that he just needed to hold on a little longer and let us work. The surgery took 4 hours, 4 hours of the most intense, focused medical work I'd ever done, and by the time we'd stabilized him and closed him up and transferred him to a private recovery room that his men had somehow arranged despite hospital protocol and regulations and every rule about patient placement, I was covered in his blood, my scrubs soaked with it, my hands trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline crash, and something else, something darker that I didn't want to examine too closely. I told the team I needed a moment, just 5 minutes to clean up and collect myself before I came back to monitor his recovery, and I practically ran to the bathroom, that small institutional bathroom with its flickering fluorescent lights and industrial soap dispensers and mirror that had seen too many exhausted, traumatized medical professionals staring back at their own reflections wondering how they'd ended up here. I made it to the sink before the shaking started, before my hands began to tremble so violently that I could barely turn on the faucet, before the tears came hot and fast and unstoppable, streaming down my face as I scrubbed at the blood under my fingernails, watching it swirl down the drain in pink-tinged water while my mind replayed every moment of the surgery, every decision I'd made, every stitch I'd placed to save the life of a man who was almost certainly responsible for deaths, just like my brothers, who built his empire on suffering and addiction and violence. I'd taken an oath, the Hippocratic oath, to do no harm, to preserve life, to treat every patient with equal care and dignity, regardless of who they were or what they'd done. But in that moment, sobbing in a hospital bathroom with a dead man's blood on my hands, I felt like I'd betrayed everything my brother's death had taught me, betrayed his memory, betrayed myself. I don't know how long I stood there crying and scrubbing and hating myself. But eventually the door opened, and I heard a voice, male and rough and completely unsympathetic, say, "Miss Castellano, you need to come with me now. Mr. Moretti is asking for you." I looked up to see one of the suits from earlier, the one with the scar running down his left cheek, and the eyes that had probably watched people die without flinching. And I wanted to refuse. Wanted to tell him that I'd done my job, and now I was done with all of this. But something in his expression told me that refusal wasn't an option. That this had stopped being about my choices the moment I'd touched his boss. The moment I'd saved his life. He escorted me, his hand on my elbow in a grip that was firm enough to communicate that this wasn't a request. Down the hallway to the private recovery room, where Dante Moretti lay in the hospital bed, looking like some fallen dark angel. His chest bandaged, his face still pale from blood loss. But his eyes, those damned eyes, bright and aware and fixed on me with an expression that made my breath catch in my throat, and my pulse spike with something that was equal parts fear and something I refused to name. "Miss Castellano," he said, his voice rough from the intubation, but still carrying that undertone of command, of absolute authority, of a man who was accustomed to being obeyed without question. "You saved my life tonight, and I am a man who pays his debts, who honors those who serve him, so I'm going to offer you an opportunity that you would be very unwise to refuse." I stood there, still in my blood-soaked scrubs, still trembling, still trying to process the nightmare my life had become in the space of a few hours, and I managed to find my voice, managed to say with more courage than I felt, "I'm a nurse. I saved your life because that's my job. That's what I do. And you don't owe me anything except to leave me alone and let me go back to my life and forget this ever happened." He smiled at that. A slow, dangerous smile that didn't reach those dark eyes. And he said something that made my blood run cold, and my stomach drop, and my entire world tilt on its axis. "I'm afraid that's not possible, piccola infermiera, because you see, your father Sal Castellano owes my organization a considerable debt. A debt that has been growing for 2 years now, since he borrowed money to pay for your brother's rehab and funeral. And that debt now belongs to me. Which means you belong to me, and you're going to come work for me as my personal nurse during my recovery. Or your father is going to pay that debt in ways that are much less pleasant than you monitoring my vital signs and changing my bandages." The room tilted, the walls closing in. My father's weakness and my brother's death, and this monster's calculated cruelty, all crashing together into a perfect storm of trapped. And I realized with absolute horror that he hadn't needed to threaten me, hadn't needed to force me, because he'd bought me, purchased my service and my time and my freedom through my father's debt, and my own inability to let someone else pay for mistakes that weren't theirs to pay for. "When do I start?" I heard myself ask, my voice hollow and defeated, and barely recognizable as my own. And Dante Moretti's smile widened just a fraction as he said, "Tomorrow night, my men will collect you from your apartment and bring you to my estate. And Emma, I can call you Emma, can't I, since we're going to be spending so much time together? I suggest you pack enough clothes for an extended stay, because once you enter my world, you don't leave until I decide you're free to go. And I'm a man who doesn't make decisions quickly when it comes to things I value, and I find that I value you very much already." The black Mercedes that arrived outside my apartment building at exactly 8 p.m. the following evening was the kind of vehicle that screamed money and power and danger. All tinted windows and gleaming paint, and an aura of menace that made my neighbors peer through their curtains and then quickly look away. Because people who lived in my building, working-class people who minded their own business and didn't ask questions about things that didn't concern them, knew instinctively that this car and the men inside it represented a world you didn't want to know about, didn't want to touch, didn't want to even acknowledge existed. I stood at my window with my hastily packed suitcase at my feet, watching Marco, the enforcer with the scar, whose name I'd learned during a terse phone call earlier that day, step out of the driver's side and look up at my third-floor window with an expression that made it crystal clear that I could either walk down on my own or be carried down. But either way, I was leaving with him tonight. Leaving my small, safe, ordinary life behind, and entering a gilded cage that I suspected would be far more difficult to escape than any prison with actual bars. The drive to the Hamptons took nearly 2 hours. 2 hours of silence broken only by the occasional phone call that Marco took in rapid Italian, his voice low and threatening as he discussed things I probably didn't want to understand. And I spent that time staring out the window at the city lights, giving way to suburbs, giving way to the exclusive estates of the wealthy and powerful, thinking about all the choices that had led me to this moment, all the decisions made by people I loved, my father's weakness, my brother's addiction, my own inability to walk away from a patient who needed saving, even when that patient was a monster who would use my compassion as a chain to bind me. We passed through gates that looked like they belonged to a maximum security facility, rather than a private residence. Gates that were manned by armed guards who waved us through with recognition and respect that bordered on fear. And then we drove up a winding private road lined with manicured hedges and ancient trees until the estate came into view. And despite my fear and anger and resentment at being forced here, I couldn't suppress a gasp at the sheer magnificence of it. Dante Moretti's home was a sprawling mansion that looked like it had been transplanted from the Italian countryside, all honey-colored stone and terracotta tiles, and graceful arches that would have been beautiful if they didn't represent the profits of violence and exploitation and human suffering, with wings that spread out on either side of a central structure like the arms of some massive bird of prey, preparing to enfold its victim in an embrace that would either protect or suffocate, and probably both. Marco pulled up to the front entrance where a woman in her 50s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, and eyes that had seen too much to be easily shocked, stood waiting. And as I climbed out of the car, with my pathetic single suitcase that suddenly seemed impossibly inadequate for whatever I was walking into, she introduced herself as Sophia, the head housekeeper, her voice carrying a faint European accent that I couldn't quite place, and a tone that suggested she'd been managing Dante Moretti's household long enough to be unimpressed by the parade of people who passed through these doors, whether they came willingly or otherwise. "Mr. Moretti is resting, but he's expecting you. You'll be staying in the East Wing with direct access to his private quarters, since you'll need to monitor him throughout the night. And I'll show you to your room where you can settle in before you begin your duties," Sophia said, already turning to lead me inside without waiting to see if I would follow. Because clearly in this world, in Dante Moretti's domain, following orders wasn't optional. It was simply the way things worked, the way power flowed from the top down in an endless cascade of command and obedience. The interior of the mansion was even more overwhelming than the exterior. All marble floors and crystal chandeliers and artwork that I suspected was original rather than reproduction. The kind of wealth that wasn't just about having money, but about having so much money that you could surround yourself with beauty and luxury as casually as other people bought furniture from IKEA. And I felt completely out of place in my jeans and sweater, carrying my discount store suitcase through halls that probably cost more per square foot than my entire year's salary. Sophia led me up a sweeping staircase to the second floor and down a hallway that seemed to stretch on forever, past closed doors that I suspected hid rooms I would never see, past security cameras that tracked our progress with unblinking electronic eyes until we reached the East Wing and she opened a door to reveal what she called my room, but what looked more like a luxury hotel suite, complete with a king-sized bed draped in silk sheets, an ensuite bathroom with marble counters and a soaking tub, floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked manicured gardens, and my stomach dropped when I noticed it, an adjoining door on the far wall that clearly connected to the next room, a door that I knew without being told led directly to Dante Moretti's private quarters. That door locks from both sides, but Mr. Moretti has asked that you keep it unlocked during the night in case he needs immediate medical attention, and your nursing supplies have been stocked in the bathroom along with scrubs in your size and anything else you might need for his care," Sophia explained. And then she fixed me with a look that was equal parts warning and something that might have been pity, adding, "Some advice, Miss Castellano, because you seem like a decent girl who got caught up in something she doesn't understand. Don't trust anyone in this house, don't ask questions about what you see or hear, don't go exploring where you're not invited, and especially don't go into the West Wing under any circumstances, because there are things happening in this house that are none of your concern, and that you're better off not knowing about." Before I could ask what she meant, before I could process that cryptic warning about the West Wing, or the fact that I was expected to sleep with an unlocked door between myself and a man who terrified and fascinated me in equal measure. Sophia was gone, leaving me alone in this beautiful prison to unpack my meager belongings and prepare myself for whatever came next. I spent the next hour arranging my things in the massive walk-in closet, where my few outfits looked ridiculous and lost, examining the extensive medical supplies that had been provided. Everything from basic wound care items to IV equipment to medications that I noted were all properly prescribed and legitimate, suggesting that Dante had access to cooperative doctors who were willing to bend rules for the right price, and trying not to think about that adjoining door, about the man on the other side of it, about the way his eyes had tracked me during surgery, as if he was memorizing every detail of my face for reasons I didn't want to contemplate. At 9 p.m., a soft knock on the adjoining door made my heart leap into my throat, and before I could respond, before I could prepare myself, the door opened, and Dante Moretti stood there, leaning heavily on a cane but otherwise looking remarkably recovered for a man who had been dying on my operating table less than 24 hours ago, wearing black silk pajama pants that hung low on his hips, and no shirt, revealing the extensive bandaging wrapped around his chest and abdomen, and also revealing the landscape of his body, the muscles and scars and the snake tattoo that wound around his left ribs, and I had to force myself to meet his eyes rather than stare at his chest like some awestruck teenager. "Emma," he said, my name sounding different in his voice, intimate and possessive, as if by speaking it he was claiming ownership of not just the word but the person it represented. "I apologize for the abruptness of your relocation, but I'm sure you understand that my recovery requires privacy and security that a hospital cannot provide, and I've arranged for you to have everything you need to make your stay here comfortable. Though I suspect comfort is the last thing on your mind right now, given that you're here against your will, and you undoubtedly hate me for forcing this arrangement." I wanted to tell him that he was right, that I did hate him, that I hated everything about this situation, and him and his world and the trap he'd sprung using my father's weakness and my own inability to let innocent people suffer for debts they didn't create. But instead I heard myself falling back on professional detachment, saying in my best clinical voice, "I'm here to do a job, Mr. Moretti, to ensure your recovery proceeds without complications, and my personal feelings are irrelevant to that responsibility. So if you'll sit down, I need to check your vitals and examine your wounds to make sure there's no sign of infection or internal bleeding." He smiled at that same dangerous smile from the hospital, and moved into my room without invitation, settling himself on the edge of my bed as if he had every right to be there, as if the boundaries between our spaces were already dissolved. And I realized with a sinking feeling that this was exactly what he intended. Not just my medical expertise, but my proximity, my presence, my constant awareness of him invading every aspect of my existence in this house. I approached him with my stethoscope and the blood pressure cuff, trying to maintain professional distance even as I had to lean in close to listen to his heart and lungs, trying to ignore the scent of him. Expensive cologne mixed with something darker and more primal that my traitorous body responded to even as my mind screamed warnings. And I felt his eyes on me the entire time, studying my face with that intense focus that made me feel like a specimen under a microscope, like he was cataloging every reaction, every micro-expression, every tiny tell that might reveal what I was thinking or feeling. His heartbeat was strong and steady under my stethoscope, his lungs clear despite the trauma they'd endured. His blood pressure elevated, but not dangerously so. And when I moved to check his bandages, carefully peeling back the tape and gauze to examine the surgical sites for any signs of complication, his hand came up to catch my wrist, not forcefully but firmly enough to stop my movement. And he asked in a voice that was too casual to be genuinely curious, "Tell me about your brother, Emma. Tell me about Michael and how he died, and why you look at me like I personally put the needle in his arm." The question hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath and making tears spring to my eyes that I furiously blinked back, because I would not cry in front of this man, would not give him the satisfaction of seeing how deeply he could wound me with just a few words. would not let him use my grief as entertainment, or manipulation, or whatever sick game he was playing. That's none of your business. That has nothing to do with your medical care, and I would appreciate it if you would let go of my wrist so I can finish my examination and leave you to rest, I managed to say, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to keep it steady. But he didn't let go. Instead, his thumb began tracing small circles on the inside of my wrist, where my pulse was hammering frantically, betraying my emotional state even as I tried to maintain a facade of calm professionalism. Everything about you is my business now, piccola infermiera, because you're in my home, under my protection and my authority, and I make it a policy to know everything about the people I allow into my inner circle, especially when those people have access to me while I'm vulnerable and recovering and potentially could kill me with a simple medication error if they were motivated by revenge or hatred, Dante said, his voice still calm and almost gentle but with an undertone of steel that reminded me exactly who and what he was capable of, how completely I was in his power within these walls. I know that Michael Castellano died 2 years ago from a fentanyl overdose. I know that the drugs were traced back to a distribution network run by the Carbone family, one of my rivals. I know that your father borrowed $50,000 from a loan shark connected to the Russo family to pay for rehab that ultimately failed and a funeral that your brother deserved. And I know that you've been paying down that debt in small installments while your father drank away his guilt and shame. But what I don't know is whether you blame all of us equally for your loss, or whether you're smart enough to understand that I had nothing to do with your brother's death, that I don't deal in drugs, that I've actually been working to push the Carbonis out of that particular business because it's dirty and destructive and brings heat from the feds that makes all of our other operations more difficult. I yanked my wrist free from his grasp, stepping back and wrapping my arms around myself like I could physically hold together the pieces of composure that were rapidly disintegrating, and I forced myself to meet his eyes even though what I saw there, genuine interest mixed with something that looked almost like understanding, made me feel even more off balance and confused. You want me to believe that you're somehow better than the men who killed my brother? That your criminal empire is more ethical or noble or justified than theirs? But you're all the same. You all profit from human weakness and desperation. You all destroy lives and families to build your fortunes, and the fact that you don't personally sell drugs doesn't make you innocent, doesn't make you anything other than another predator in an expensive suit, I said. And I watched his expression shift, watched something dark and almost hurt flash across his features before it was replaced by that mask of controlled power that I suspected was his default setting. The armor he wore to survive in a world where showing vulnerability meant death. You're right. Of course, I am a predator. I've built my empire on violence and fear and the exploitation of human weakness. But I'm a predator with rules, with boundaries, with a code that keeps me from becoming a complete monster, and whether you believe it or not, I had my reasons for acquiring your father's debt, for engineering this situation that has brought you into my home, Dante said, rising from the bed with obvious difficulty and pain that he was too proud to fully show, moving toward the adjoining door but pausing in the threshold to look back at me with an expression I couldn't read. Get some rest, Emma. Tomorrow I'll introduce you to the household routine, and you'll begin your regular nursing duties. And I promise you that while you're here, while you're under my roof and my protection, no harm will come to you. No one will touch you or threaten you or make you feel unsafe, because you are mine now, and I protect what belongs to me with everything I have. He left then, closing the door behind him, but I noticed he didn't lock it from his side, leaving that decision to me. That small illusion of control that we both knew was meaningless, because locked doors wouldn't keep him out if he truly wanted in, wouldn't protect me from a man who had already invaded my life so completely that I wasn't sure where his influence ended and my own will began. I did lock it, though, needing that symbolic barrier even if it was ultimately useless, and I collapsed onto the bed that smelled faintly of lavender and expensive fabric softener, my mind racing with everything that had happened, everything he'd said, the casual way he'd revealed that he knew intimate details about my life and loss, and had somehow engineered this entire situation for reasons he hadn't fully explained. Sleep was impossible, my thoughts spiraling between anger and fear and confusion and something else. Something dangerous that whispered in the back of my mind that maybe he was right. Maybe he was different from the men who'd killed Michael. Maybe there were gradations of darkness, and his particular shadow was somehow less absolute than others. And I hated myself for even entertaining that thought, for allowing his words and presence and inexplicable interest in me to create doubt where there should only be certainty about what he was and what he represented. Hours passed with me staring at the ceiling, watching shadows shift as the moon moved across the sky, until around 3 a.m., when I heard something that made me sit bolt upright in bed, my heart pounding. A sound coming from somewhere else in the house, distant but distinct. A sound that my trained ear recognized immediately as someone crying out in pain. A woman's voice, young and frightened and desperate, coming from what I suspected was the direction of the forbidden West Wing that Sophia had warned me about. Every instinct I had as a nurse, every impulse that had driven me into medicine in the first place, screamed at me to investigate, to find the source of that pain and offer help. But Sophia's warning echoed in my mind, along with Dante's promise of protection that came with the implicit threat of what might happen if I disobeyed the rules of his house. And I sat frozen in indecision, listening to those cries fade into whimpers and then silence, wondering what kind of horrors were happening in other parts of this beautiful prison, and whether my presence here, my complicity through silence and inaction, was making me just as guilty as the monsters who ran this place. And I knew with sinking certainty that tomorrow night, consequences be damned, I was going to find out exactly what was happening in that West Wing, because I hadn't taken an oath to save only the lives that were convenient or safe to save. And if there was someone suffering in this house, someone who needed help that no one else was willing to provide, then I would find a way to reach them even if it meant risking everything I had left, including my life. The next 7 days passed in a strange rhythm that felt simultaneously endless and impossibly fast, each day blurring into the next as I settled into the surreal routine of being Dante Moretti's personal nurse in his fortress of wealth and violence, spending my mornings checking his vital signs and changing his bandages with clinical precision, while trying to ignore the way his dark eyes followed my every movement with an intensity that made my skin prickle with awareness. My afternoons monitoring his physical therapy exercises as he pushed himself harder than any patient should while recovering from near-fatal injuries because he insisted that weakness was unacceptable and rest was a luxury he couldn't afford. And my evenings administering medications and documenting his progress in meticulous detail because focusing on the medical charts kept me from thinking too much about how comfortable I was becoming in this gilded cage, how my initial terror was slowly being replaced by something far more dangerous that felt disturbingly like belonging. Dante was unlike any patient I'd ever treated, refusing pain medications beyond the first 2 days because he claimed he needed to stay sharp and alert for the constant stream of business that flowed through his bedroom via encrypted phones and video calls and visits from his various lieutenants who would appear at all hours to discuss things in rapid Italian, while I pretended not to listen, but couldn't help absorbing fragments of conversations about shipments and territories and people who had become problems that needed to be solved in ways that made my blood run cold. He endured the agony of his healing wounds with a stoicism that was almost inhuman, his jaw clenching and his hands gripping the bedsheets until his knuckles went white when I cleaned and dressed his injuries. But he never cried out, never complained, never showed weakness in front of anyone including me. And I found myself reluctantly admiring that iron control, even as I professionally disapproved of his refusal to accept appropriate pain management that would aid his recovery. But it was during the quiet moments, the times when his enforcers and advisors had left, and it was just the two of us in his enormous bedroom, with its dark wood furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the estate grounds, that Dante revealed pieces of himself that didn't fit with the cold crime lord image, talking to me while I worked as if my presence was as necessary as the medical care I provided, telling me about inheriting his father's empire at 19, when Giuseppe Moretti was gunned down in a restaurant in Little Italy, about the brutal years of consolidating power and eliminating rivals who saw his youth as weakness, about learning that mercy was a liability and compassion was a weapon that your enemies would use to destroy you. He spoke about his mother who had died of cancer when he was 7, leaving him in the care of a father who showed love through demands for perfection and strength, and about his younger sister Isabella, who was killed at 18 in crossfire during a territorial dispute with the Carbone family, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time when a peace meeting turned into an ambush, her death transforming whatever humanity remained in Dante into something harder and colder and utterly merciless toward anyone who threatened what he considered his. I listened to these confessions while monitoring his blood pressure and checking his surgical sites for signs of infection, and despite my determination to maintain professional distance, despite my repeated internal reminders that this man represented everything I should despise, I found myself responding to his stories with my own, telling him about growing up with a father who was always on the periphery of organized crime but never important enough to provide real security or prosperity, about watching my mother work herself into an early grave trying to maintain respectability while married to a man who brought nothing but shame, about my brother Michael, who was so desperate to escape the suffocating mediocrity of our lives that he'd turned to drugs and found a temporary heaven that became a permanent hell. Dante listened with an attention that felt absolute, as if in those moments I was the only thing in his universe that mattered. And he said something that surprised me with its insight and unexpected gentleness, observing that we were both survivors of worlds that had tried to break us, both shaped by losses that had taught us that love was dangerous and trust was foolish, both building walls around ourselves that were really prisons we'd constructed from our own fear and pain. The growing intimacy between us terrified me more than any threat he could have made, because threats I could resist, force I could endure. But this slow erosion of my defenses through understanding and shared vulnerability was something I had no tools to fight against, and I found myself thinking about him during the hours when I should have been resting, replaying our conversations and analyzing the expressions that crossed his face when he thought I wasn't watching, trying to reconcile the man who spoke about his dead sister with tears threatening in his eyes with the man I'd witnessed ordering someone's execution over the phone with chilling casualness. My confusion deepened when small acts of thoughtfulness began appearing in my daily life. My favorite coffee appearing on my nightstand each morning, despite my never having mentioned my preference. Books I'd casually mentioned wanting to read materializing in my room. A laptop and phone provided so I could stay connected to the outside world even though I suspected every communication was monitored. And once, after I'd mentioned missing my mother's recipe for pasta carbonara during a casual conversation, finding that exact dish prepared by the estate's chef and delivered to my room with a note in Dante's distinctive handwriting that simply said, "Some memories deserve to be preserved." But every time I felt myself softening toward him, every time I caught myself smiling at something he said, or feeling a flutter of anticipation when it was time for his evening vital check, I would hear sounds from the West Wing that reminded me exactly where I was and who I was dealing with. Sometimes raised voices arguing in Italian, sometimes the sound of footsteps and doors slamming in the middle of the night, and always, haunting me through the darkness, those occasional cries of pain that my medical instincts screamed at me to investigate, while my survival instincts warned me to ignore. I'd asked Sophia about the West Wing on my 3rd day, as casually as I could manage while she was showing me where the fresh linens were stored, and the look she'd given me was pure warning mixed with what might have been genuine concern, telling me again that there were things in this house that weren't my business, that Mr. Moretti had his reasons for keeping certain areas restricted, and that curiosity had ended more than one person's employment, and sometimes their lives in this world, where secrets were currency and knowledge was often a death sentence, on the 8th night of my captivity. And I still thought of it as captivity despite the luxury and the growing complexity of my feelings toward my captor. I woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of a woman crying. Not the distant sounds I'd heard before, but close, heartbreakingly close, coming from just beyond my door in the hallway. And before I could think through the wisdom or consequences of what I was doing, I was out of bed and opening my door to find a young girl, barely 18 if that, huddled against the wall with her knees drawn up to her chest and tears streaming down a face that was beautiful despite being swollen and bruised, wearing a thin nightgown that did nothing to hide the evidence of recent violence marking her arms and shoulders. My nursing instincts completely overrode any sense of self-preservation, and I was kneeling beside her, asking in my gentlest voice what had happened and whether she needed medical attention before I even registered that I was potentially involving myself in exactly the kind of situation Sophia had warned me about. But the girl looked up at me with eyes full of such desperate hope and fear that I couldn't have walked away if Dante himself had ordered me to. "Please, you're the nurse. Everyone says there's an American nurse staying in the East Wing. Please, can you help me? My ribs hurt so badly and I think something might be broken, and they won't let me see a doctor because he says I'm not worth the risk of outside attention," the girl said in English, heavily accented with Italian, her words tumbling out in a rush, as if she feared I might disappear before she could explain. And I helped her to her feet as carefully as possible, noting the way she gasped and clutched her side, and the shallow breathing that suggested she was right about the broken ribs, possibly even a punctured lung if the injury was severe enough. I should have taken her to my room, should have treated her there where we'd have privacy and medical supplies. But something made me ask her where she'd come from. And when she gestured weakly toward the West Wing, when she said she'd managed to slip away while her guard was distracted by a phone call, I made a decision that I knew was monumentally stupid and potentially fatal, but that I couldn't not make. Telling her to show me where she was being kept, because I needed to see the full extent of the situation and gather any medical supplies that might be available there. She led me through corridors I hadn't explored, past more security cameras that I prayed weren't actively monitored at this hour, until we reached a heavy door that she said led to her room, and when we entered, I found myself in what could only be described as a cell made comfortable, a bedroom that had all the physical amenities, a bed, a bathroom, even a television, but with windows that were barred, and a door that locked from the outside, and an atmosphere of imprisonment that no amount of expensive furnishing could disguise. "My name is Lucia Carbone," the girl said as I helped her onto the bed and began a careful physical examination, my hands gentle as I palpated her ribs and felt the distinctive grinding sensation of bone fragments moving against each other that confirmed at least 2 fractures. "And I've been here for 3 weeks since Dante Moretti's men took me from my father's house during a raid. And everyone says I'm being held as collateral to ensure my father doesn't retaliate for some business dispute. But I think the real reason is that my father won't take me back now, won't want me after I've been in an enemy's home, will consider me ruined and worthless and a shame to our family name." The name Carbone hit me like ice water, the same family responsible for the drug distribution network that had killed my brother. And I had to reconcile this frightened, injured girl with my image of the monsters who ran that organization. Had to process the cognitive dissonance of sympathizing with someone who shared blood with the people I'd spent 2 years hating. "How did you get hurt?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer, didn't want confirmation of what kind of violence happened in this house. And Lucia's face crumpled as she explained that one of the guards, a man named Victor who Dante had assigned to watch her, had gotten drunk and aggressive 2 nights ago. And when she'd fought back against his advances, he'd beaten her badly enough to crack her ribs and leave bruises that painted her skin in shades of purple and black. Rage, pure and incandescent, flooded through me at the thought of this girl being assaulted under Dante's roof by one of his men, and I found myself making promises I had no authority to make. Telling Lucia that I would treat her injuries and make sure she was safe, and that I would talk to Dante about the guard who'd hurt her. Because whatever else he was, whatever crimes he'd committed, he'd promised me that no one under his protection would be harmed, and surely that protection extended to his prisoners even if they were the daughters of his enemies. I spent the next hour working with the limited supplies I found in Lucia's bathroom, basic first aid items that were woefully inadequate for her injuries, doing what I could to stabilize her ribs with an improvised compression wrap, and administering some basic pain medication I'd brought from my own room, all while listening to her story of a life in the Mafia where women were property and bargaining chips, valued only for their ability to cement alliances through marriage or provide leverage through their capture. And I realized with uncomfortable clarity that Lucia and I weren't so different. Both of us trapped in this world through accidents of birth and circumstance. Both of us trying to survive in the spaces between powerful men and their endless wars. I was so focused on Lucia's care that I didn't hear the door open behind me. Didn't sense another presence in the room until Dante's voice, cold and sharp as a blade, cut through the quiet, saying, "What exactly do you think you're doing in here, Emma? And who gave you permission to treat my prisoner or to be in the West Wing that I explicitly told you was off limits?" I turned to find him standing in the doorway, leaning heavily on his cane, his face pale with either pain or anger or both. Still recovering enough that he shouldn't be out of bed and certainly shouldn't be walking through his estate in the middle of the night. But his eyes were burning with an intensity that made me simultaneously want to shrink back and stand my ground. "I'm doing my job," I said, rising to face him with more courage than I felt, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "I'm providing medical care to someone who desperately needs it. Someone who was assaulted by one of your men while under your supposed protection. And if you have a problem with that, then you can fire me or punish me or do whatever it is you do to people who disobey you. But I'm not going to apologize for helping an injured girl who had nowhere else to turn." Something flickered across Dante's face. Surprise, maybe. Or respect. Or fury that I'd defied him so directly. And he moved into the room with visible effort, his attention shifting from me to Lucia, who had shrunk back against the headboard in obvious terror of the man who held her fate in his hands. "Lucia Carbone," he said, his voice softening slightly, though still carrying that undertone of absolute authority. "Tell me exactly what happened with Victor. Tell me everything. And understand that I take the violation of my rules very seriously, especially when those rules concern the treatment of people in my custody." Lucia, trembling and crying, told him the same story she'd told me. And I watched Dante's expression grow darker and more dangerous with every word, until by the end his hands were clenched so tightly around his cane that his knuckles were white, and a muscle was jumping in his jaw. "Emma, finish treating her injuries properly, and then move her to one of the guest rooms in the East Wing, where she'll be more comfortable and where you can monitor her recovery. And tomorrow I'll arrange for a proper doctor to examine her and take x-rays to ensure there's no internal damage," Dante said. And then he turned to Lucia, with an expression that was somehow both terrifying and oddly gentle, adding, "You're here because your father's actions required consequences. But you're not here to be abused or degraded or treated as anything less than a guest in my home, and Victor will answer for what he's done to you in ways that will ensure no one else ever makes the same mistake." He left then, moving more slowly than his pride probably wanted to show, and I heard him in the hallway making phone calls, his voice rising in barely controlled fury as he spoke in rapid Italian to people I assumed were his security team. And within minutes, Marco appeared to help move Lucia to a new room, while other men I didn't recognize were presumably dealing with Victor in ways I didn't want to imagine. As I settled Lucia into her new accommodations, vastly more comfortable than her previous cell, and with an actual lock on the inside of the door so she could control her own security, she grabbed my hand and said with tears in her eyes, "Everyone says Dante Moretti is a monster without mercy or conscience, but he just showed me more protection and care than my own father ever did. And I don't understand this world anymore. Don't understand who the real monsters are when the man who kidnapped me treats me better than the family who was supposed to love me." I had no answer for her because I was grappling with the same confusion, the same unsettling realization that the moral certainties I'd built my life on were crumbling under the weight of a more complex reality. And as I finally returned to my own room as dawn was breaking, exhausted and emotionally wrung out, I found Dante waiting for me, sitting on my bed despite the pain it must have caused him to climb the stairs and walk this far, and the expression on his face was something I'd never seen before. Vulnerable, and uncertain, and almost afraid. "You could have let Victor's abuse continue, Could have ignored Lucia's suffering and stayed safe in your room. Could have obeyed my rules and minded your own business, but instead you risked my anger and potentially your life to help the daughter of a man whose organization killed your brother. And I need to understand why. Need to know what kind of person does that. What kind of conscience drives someone to show compassion to people who don't deserve it, Dante said, and I moved to stand in front of him, looking down at this powerful, dangerous man who somehow seemed smaller and more human in this moment. And I told him the truth, that I was only just beginning to fully understand myself. I don't help people because they deserve it. I help them because they need it, and because I can. Because the oath I took wasn't conditional on the worthiness of my patients. And maybe I can't control the violence and corruption of this world, can't fix the systems that destroy lives, but I can control my own choices, can decide that I'm going to be someone who eases suffering wherever I find it, regardless of the consequences, I said. And Dante reached out to take my hand, pulling me down to sit beside him on the bed. And he looked at me with those dark eyes that I was learning to read, that I could see were filled with something that looked terrifyingly like devotion, mixed with desire and a hunger that had nothing to do with physical want, and everything to do with a soul-deep need to be seen and understood, and maybe even saved. "Don't let me die, Emma," he whispered. But I knew he wasn't talking about his physical wounds anymore, wasn't referring to the bullets and surgery and recovery. He was talking about something deeper, something in himself that he feared was already dead or dying. And before I could think through what I was doing or what it meant, I found myself responding not as his nurse, but as a woman who was falling for a man she shouldn't want, saying, "I won't. I promise I won't let you die, but you have to promise me something too. Promise me that you'll try to be the man I saw tonight, the man who protected Lucia and showed mercy, the man who seems to understand that power carries responsibility for the people who can't protect themselves." 3 weeks had passed since the night I found Lucia bleeding and broken in the West Wing. 3 weeks during which the dynamics of my imprisonment had shifted in ways I couldn't fully articulate, but felt in every interaction with Dante, in every lingering glance and accidental touch and conversation that stretched long into the night. 3 weeks of watching him heal physically while something else entirely was happening between us that terrified me because it felt like falling and flying simultaneously, like standing at the edge of an abyss and wanting to jump, not despite the danger but because of it. Lucia had become a strange sort of companion in this gilded prison, recovering in her guest room under my medical supervision, but also becoming a friend. Someone who understood the peculiar horror and seduction of being trapped in Dante's orbit, and she'd confided in me during one of our long afternoon conversations that she could see the way he looked at me when he thought no one was watching, could recognize the hunger and possessiveness, and something deeper that she called love, though I refused to acknowledge that particular word, because loving Dante Moretti would mean accepting that I'd betrayed everything my brother's death had taught me about the cost of this world. Dante himself was nearly fully recovered, moving without the cane now, though I could still see him favoring his left side when he thought I wasn't paying attention, conducting his business from his office rather than his bedroom, slowly resuming the full scope of his operations as the head of one of New York's most powerful crime families. And I knew without being told that my time here was running short, that soon he wouldn't need a personal nurse and whatever excuse had kept me in his house would evaporate, leaving me to face the question of whether I would stay by choice or leave and return to a life that suddenly seemed impossibly small and empty, compared to the intensity of existing in Dante's world. We'd settled into a routine that felt dangerously domestic, my mornings still beginning with checking his healing wounds, though the intimacy of those sessions had taken on a different quality, charged with an awareness that had nothing to do with medical care, and everything to do with the way his breath would catch when my fingers traced the edges of his scars, the way my pulse would race when he'd catch my hand and hold it against his chest so I could feel his heartbeat, strong and steady and alive because I'd saved him, because my skill and determination had pulled him back from death and created a bond between us that felt more profound than anything I'd experienced before. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night, when the carefully maintained peace of the estate was shattered by gunfire and shouting and the acrid smell of smoke drifting through the open windows. And I was in my room reading when Marco burst through my door without knocking, his face grim and his weapon drawn, telling me that the Carbone family had launched an assault on the compound, that they'd somehow breached the outer security and were making their way toward the main house, and that Dante had ordered me brought to the panic room immediately for my protection. I'd started to follow him when I remembered Lucia, alone and vulnerable in her guest room on the other side of the wing, and I told Marco that I wasn't going anywhere without her, that if the Carbones were here for their daughter, then leaving her unprotected was sentencing her to whatever violence her father had planned for a girl he considered ruined and worthless. And I could see Marco's internal struggle between following Dante's orders and recognizing the logic of my argument before he cursed in Italian and led me at a run toward Lucia's room. We found her frozen with terror, the sound of approaching gunfire getting closer with every second. And I grabbed her hand and let Marco lead us both through a maze of hallways I'd never seen before, down a concealed staircase hidden behind a bookshelf in Dante's study, into a reinforced room deep in the basement that looked like it could withstand a nuclear blast, with its steel-lined walls and banks of security monitors showing various angles of the estate grounds, where I could see armed men in tactical gear exchanging fire with Dante's security force. Marco sealed us inside with instructions to stay put no matter what we heard, to wait until either he or Dante came to get us personally, and then he was gone, leaving Lucia and me alone in the bunker, while above us a war raged for reasons I only partially understood. Something about territory and respect, and the violation of taking a rival's daughter and holding her for weeks while her father's reputation suffered. The monitors showed me more than I wanted to see. Showed me Dante moving through his own grounds with a weapon in his hands and a team of his most trusted men around him. His movements fluid and deadly despite his recent injuries. And I watched in horrified fascination as he personally took down 2 attackers who'd made it into the main house. His efficiency and lethality undeniable and terrifying and somehow mesmerizing. And I realized that this was who he really was beneath the expensive suits and cultured conversation. A man built for violence, shaped by it, excelling at it in ways that should have repulsed me but instead made me understand how he'd survived and thrived in a world that killed weaker men. Lucia was crying, beside me, terrified that her father's men would find her, that they'd drag her back to face punishment for allowing herself to be captured, for bringing shame to the family name. And I held her while my eyes stayed glued to the monitors, tracking Dante's progress through the house, my heart in my throat every time he rounded a corner or entered a room where danger might be waiting. The assault lasted 47 minutes, according to the timestamp on the security footage. 47 minutes that felt like hours. 47 minutes during which I discovered that I was praying. Me, who hadn't prayed since my brother's funeral, who'd lost faith in any benevolent deity when Michael died. Praying desperately that Dante would survive this, that the man I'd saved on an operating table wouldn't die in a gunfight in his own home before I could tell him all the things I'd been too afraid to acknowledge, too afraid to speak aloud. When the sounds of fighting finally ceased, and the monitors showed Dante's men securing the perimeter and dragging away bodies and zip-tying the few attackers who'd been taken alive, when the steel door of the panic room finally opened to reveal Dante himself, covered in blood and gunpowder residue, but alive and standing, and looking at me with eyes that burned with relief and rage and desperate need. I didn't think, didn't hesitate, didn't let my rational mind intervene before I was running to him, throwing my arms around him despite the blood and the violence and everything he represented, and feeling his arms close around me with crushing force, as if he needed the physical confirmation that I was real and safe and still his. "If we die tonight," Dante said against my hair, his voice rough and shaking with adrenaline and emotion, "I need you to know that I've never wanted anything the way I want you. Not power, not revenge, not empire or legacy or anything else that I've spent my life building and fighting for. None of it means anything compared to the terror I felt thinking that they might get to you, that I might lose you before I could make you understand what you've become to me." The words broke something open inside me, shattered the last of my defenses that had been crumbling since the night I'd found Lucia, since I'd seen Dante show mercy and protection and humanity, and I pulled back just enough to look up at his face, at the man who'd trapped me and saved me and changed me in equal measure. And I heard myself confessing with tears streaming down my face. I hate that I don't hate you anymore. I hate that I think about you every moment. I hate that I'm terrified of leaving here because somehow this prison became home, and you became the person I can't imagine my life without. And I don't know how to reconcile loving you with everything I believed about myself and the world and what's right and wrong. Dante's hands came up to frame my face, his thumbs brushing away my tears with a gentleness that seemed impossible from hands that had just taken lives, and he said with absolute conviction and vulnerability that stripped away every pretense of the untouchable crime lord, "Then don't reconcile it. Don't try to make it fit into neat categories of right and wrong. Just feel it, Emma. Just let yourself feel what's happening between us, and deal with the moral complexity later. Because I've spent my entire life being what this world demanded I become, being the monster that circumstances created, but with you I remember what it feels like to be human, to want something pure and good even if I don't deserve it, even if claiming it damns us both." He kissed me then, or I kissed him, or we crashed together in a collision that had been building since the moment our eyes met in that emergency room. And his kiss was desperate and angry and passionate and reverent all at once, tasting of violence and vulnerability, of death survived and life claimed, and I kissed him back with everything I'd been holding back, every feeling I'd denied, every truth I'd been too afraid to speak. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, both trembling with emotion and adrenaline and desire that went far beyond physical want, I knew that I'd crossed a line I could never uncross, that I'd chosen him despite every rational reason not to. And the terrifying part was that I couldn't find it in myself to regret it, couldn't summon the shame or guilt that I knew I should feel, could only feel this overwhelming certainty that somehow, impossibly, I'd found exactly where I belonged, in the arms of a man who represented everything I'd spent my life running from. The morning after the assault dawned cold and clear, the winter sunlight streaming through the windows of Dante's bedroom, where I'd spent the night wrapped in his arms. Both of us too shaken and too desperate for the confirmation of each other's continued existence to maintain any pretense of professional boundaries or emotional distance, and I woke to find him already awake, watching me with an expression that was equal parts possession and wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe that I was real, that I'd chosen to stay. That after everything, the violence and the blood and the gunfight that had turned his estate into a war zone, I'd still come to his bed not as his captive but as his lover, his partner, his chosen sanctuary in a world that offered neither of us much safety or peace. The aftermath of the attack had left 13 of the Carbone family's men dead, 5 more captured and being held somewhere I didn't ask about, because there were still things about Dante's world that I needed to maintain ignorance of if I wanted to preserve whatever remained of my conscience. And the message had been sent clearly to Lucia's father and every other family who might have considered Dante vulnerable during his recovery. He was as dangerous as ever, as ruthless as ever, as untouchable as ever, and attacking his home had been a fatal miscalculation that would reshape the power dynamics of New York's underworld for years to come. But there was one piece of unfinished business, one loose end that needed resolution. And at 10 that morning, I heard voices in the foyer and recognized my father's rough Brooklyn accent mixed with Marco's more refined tones. And I knew without being told that Dante had summoned him, that this day would bring the confrontation I'd been both dreading and needing since the night I was first brought to this estate under the weight of debts I hadn't incurred and obligations I hadn't chosen. I dressed carefully in jeans and a simple sweater, armor of normalcy against the momentous nature of what was coming. And when I descended the stairs, I found my father looking smaller and more broken than I remembered, his shoulders hunched with shame and his eyes unable to meet mine, standing in Dante's study like a man awaiting sentencing, which in a very real sense he was, his fate dependent on the mercy of a man who was not known for granting second chances or forgiving debts easily. Dante stood behind his desk, every inch the powerful Don, despite the faint evidence of healing wounds visible in the careful way he held himself. And when I entered the room, his expression softened fractionally before returning to the mask of authority he wore when conducting business. And he gestured for me to sit in one of the leather chairs facing the desk while my father remained standing. A subtle power dynamic that spoke volumes about their relative positions in this negotiation. "Sal Castellano," Dante began, his voice carrying that tone of absolute command that I'd heard him use during business dealings. "Your debt to my organization, including interest and penalties accumulated over 2 years, now totals $73,000, a sum that you have no realistic ability to repay given your limited income and expensive habits, which means that by all rights I could demand payment in the traditional ways, through service, through sacrifice, through methods that would leave you significantly worse off than you are currently." My father flinched at these words, his hands trembling, and I felt a complicated surge of anger and pity for this weak man, whose choices had trapped both his children, whose inability to resist his vices had cost Michael his life and me my freedom. "However," Dante continued, and now his eyes moved to me, holding my gaze with an intensity that made my breath catch. "Your daughter has proven herself to be valuable beyond any monetary calculation, has saved my life and changed it in ways that cannot be measured in dollars or traditional debts. And so I'm prepared to offer you a deal that is far more generous than you deserve. Your debt is forgiven, completely and permanently, with no further obligation or expectation of repayment, on one condition." The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by my father's sharp intake of breath and the sound of my own heart pounding in my ears, and I waited for Dante to reveal what price he would extract, what new trap he was laying. But his next words weren't what I expected, weren't what any of us expected. "The condition is that you accept responsibility for your choices, that you acknowledge the harm your weakness caused both your children, that you get sober and stay sober and rebuild some semblance of a life worth living. Because Emma deserves a father who is present and clean and capable of being someone she can respect rather than resent. And I will not have the woman I love carrying the burden of your failures for the rest of her life." The phrase, "the woman I love," hung in the air like a bomb detonating in slow motion, reshaping everything, redefining everything, and my father's eyes went wide with shock and understanding, recognizing that this wasn't just about debts and obligations anymore, that something profound had happened between his daughter and this dangerous man during the weeks of my captivity, turned something else. Entirely. "You're free to leave, Emma," Dante said, turning his full attention to me now. And in his eyes I could see vulnerability and fear barely masked by his usual control. "Your father's debt is paid, your obligation to me is fulfilled, and I'm offering you the choice that was taken from you when Marco brought you here. Stay with me because you want to, because you choose this life and choose me despite all the very valid reasons not to, or walk away now and return to your nursing career and your safe, normal existence. And I promise you that neither you nor your father will ever be bothered by me or anyone in my organization again." He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a key, ornate and antique and clearly significant. And he held it out to me as he explained, "This is the master key to everything I own, every property, every account, every door in my empire, and I'm giving it to you not as a gift or a bribe, but as a symbol of what I'm offering, not ownership of you, not possession or control, but partnership, equality in the personal sphere even if my professional world is violence and darkness, a place beside me as the person who keeps me human, who reminds me that there's more to existence than power and revenge and the endless cycle of bloodshed that has defined my life." I looked at that key, at my father's shocked face, at Dante's expression of desperate hope mixed with the absolute certainty that he was giving me something precious and irreplaceable, and I thought about all the paths that had led me to this moment. Michael's death, my father's debts, the night Dante was brought bleeding into my emergency room, the weeks of forced proximity that had become chosen intimacy, Lucia's rescue, and the assault on the estate. and the kiss that had shattered all my carefully maintained boundaries. I thought about the woman I'd been, so certain of right and wrong, so convinced that the world could be divided into victims and monsters with no space for the complicated reality of people who were both and neither. And I realized that Dante had been right when he said I'd changed, that saving him had transformed me in ways that went far beyond simple medical intervention, that somewhere in the process of healing his body, I'd begun to understand that healing could also mean accepting complexity, embracing moral ambiguity, choosing love even when it came wrapped in darkness and danger. "I'm staying," I said, rising from my chair and crossing to take the key from Dante's hand, feeling the weight of it, the responsibility and trust it represented. "But not as your possession or your prize or even just your lover. I'm staying as your conscience, your connection to the humanity you're afraid you've lost, your personal medicine against the poison of this life that you were born into and shaped by but don't have to be completely consumed by." I turned to my father, seeing him clearly maybe for the first time, not as the villain of my story, but as a broken man who'd done terrible damage through weakness rather than malice. And I told him with more compassion than I'd thought I could muster. "Get help, Dad. Real help. And maybe someday we can build something like a relationship. But until then, know that I forgive you. Not because you deserve it, but because I refuse to let your choices poison the rest of my life the way they poisoned Michael's." Dante dismissed my father then, with a generosity that was probably more for my benefit than from any genuine concern for Sal Castellano's well-being, arranging for him to enter a treatment program that the organization apparently funded for family members of associates. And when we were finally alone in his study, Dante did something that took my breath away. He dropped to one knee before me, this powerful crime lord kneeling like a supplicant, and he placed my hand over his heart, where I could feel it beating strong and steady beneath my palm. "Then heal me, Emma Castellano," he said, his voice rough with emotion that he wasn't trying to hide anymore, wasn't trying to control or suppress. "Heal me every day for the rest of our lives. Fight me when I'm wrong, challenge me when I'm cruel. Remind me that power carries responsibility, and that the people under my protection deserve more than just survival. They deserve dignity and care. And I swear to you that I'll spend every day trying to be a man worth saving, worth loving, worth the sacrifice you're making by choosing this life." I pulled him to his feet and kissed him with everything I felt, everything I'd discovered about myself, and about love, and about the strange alchemy that transforms two broken people into something stronger than either could be alone. And I knew that this was my answer, my commitment, my choice freely made. The story of how a trauma nurse fell in love with a mafia boss isn't a fairy tale, isn't a redemption arc where love conquers all and transforms monsters into princes. But it's real in a way that fairy tales never are. Real in its acknowledgement that people are complicated and love is messy, and choosing to stay means accepting darkness along with light, violence along with tenderness, a future uncertain and dangerous, but infinitely more vivid than any safe alternative. I'm no longer the woman who cried in a hospital bathroom over blood-stained hands, no longer the girl who thought the world was divided into clear categories of good and evil, innocent and guilty, savable and damned. I'm Emma Castellano, personal nurse and conscience and partner to Dante Moretti, healer of wounds both physical and spiritual, keeper of keys to an empire built on violence but maybe, just maybe, capable of evolution into something better. And if I'm damaging my soul by loving a man who deals in death, then he's going to spend every day earning that damage, proving that even in the darkest places, even in the most compromised circumstances, even in love that begins in captivity and blooms in blood, there can be genuine connection, real transformation, and the hope that tomorrow might be slightly better than today. And that hope, that desperate, defiant, beautiful hope, is medicine enough for both of us.